Good evening, everyone. Welcome to all in this third technical session, that is the live question answer session of day 2 of the 3 days international webinar on Neither East nor West, Vistas of Postcolonial Discourses, being organized by Department of English, Women's College, Agartala, Tripura, India. In this session, we are having with us Professor Francis Xavier Clooney, Parkman Professor of Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology from Harvard University, USA. I, on behalf of the organizing committee and my own behalf, passionately welcome you, sir, in our webinar. Sir, with your permission, I want to take the golden opportunity to introduce you to our learned audience, sir. May I, sir?
Please, definitely.
Yes, sir. Professor Francis Xavier Clooney is the Parkman Professor of Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology at Harvard Divinity School. After earning his doctorate in South Asian languages and civilizations from the University of Chicago in 1984, he taught at Boston College for 21 years before going to Harvard, which he joined in 2005. He is a Roman Catholic priest and has been a member of the Society of Jesus for 50 years. He serves regularly in a Catholic parish on weekends. From 2007 to 2016, he blogged regularly in the In All Things section of America magazine online and on his current blog site, The Inner Age. His primary areas of Indological scholarship are theological commentarial writings in the Sanskrit and Tamil traditions of Hindu India. He is also a leading figure globally in the developing field of comparative theology, a discipline distinguished by attentiveness to the dynamics of theological learning depend through the study of traditions other than one's own. He has also written on the Jesuit missionary tradition, particularly in India, on the early Jesuit Pan-Asian discourse on reincarnation, and on the dynamics of dialogue and interreligious learning in the contemporary world. Professor Clooney is the author of numerous articles and books, including Thinking Ritually, Retrieving the Purva Mimamsa of Germany, published by Vienna in the year 1990, Theology After Vedanta, an experiment in comparative theology, Beyond Compare, St. Francis de Sales and Sri Vedanta Desika on loving surrender to God, The Truth, the Way, the Life, Christian commentary on the 3 holy mantras of the Sri Vaishnava Hindus, Comparative Theology, Deep Learning Across Religious Borders, and His Hiding Place is Darkness, a Hindu-Catholic Theopoetics of Divine Absence. So recent books include Reading the Hindu and Christian Classics, Why and How It Matters, and Western Jesuit Scholars in India, Tracing Their Paths, Reassessing Their Goals. Forthcoming is a new translation of the Hindu theologian Ramanuja's Manual of Daily Worship in the International Journal of Hindu Studies. In July 2010, he was elected a Fellow of the British Academy and has served as a professorial research fellow at the Australian Catholic University. Sir was awarded with honorary doctorates from College of the Holy Cross in 2011, from Australian Catholic University in 2012, from Haythrop College, University of London in 2017, and his most recent honorary doctorate was awarded in November 2019 by Regis College, University of Toronto. From 2010 to 2017, he was the director of the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard University. He is currently Vice President of the Catholic Theological Society of America and will be the President during 2022 to 23. Hailed as the founder of modern comparative theology, Professor Clooney was given the 2017 John Courtney Murray Award for Distinguished Theological Achievement from the Catholic Theological Society of America. We are extremely honored, sir, to have you among us in this QA session, and I find myself blessed and fortunate to introduce you to the audience, sir?
Thank you very much. I might say as a first word before you ask any questions or comments that I'm very pleased to be part of this webinar. I'm grateful to the Department of English, the Women's College in Agartala in Tripura. I would like to visit personally someday. It sounds very beautiful. And I'm way far away in Boston, Massachusetts, but nonetheless, I'm grateful for this opportunity. And particularly to you, Professor Dr. Somali Saha, for your kind invitation and your kind introduction just now. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. I am feeling really blessed, sir, with your words. Sir, can I go for the question, sir?
Yes.
Yes, sir. Sir, the first question, it's a very general one. So being an American and a Roman Catholic priest, you had been visiting India from America for nearly 45 years. So why did you come to India and why did you keep coming back? Would you please share some of your memorable experiences just staying in India with our audience?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So back in 1968, as you mentioned, I became a Jesuit, entered the Society of Jesus. And part of our training before becoming priest is to do some teaching, to have some practical experience. And one option I had was to do that training in New York City, where I was born and grew up. Another option was to go somewhere else. And early on, I had an instinct that I would love to go to India. There was a sense that this was a fascinating culture, a fascinating country. I knew of great figures like Swami Vivekananda, Dr. Radhakrishnan, Mahatma Gandhi, and then Mother Teresa and other such figures. And so I explored the possibility of spending some time teaching at one of our schools in India. It turned out to be difficult in terms of visas and so on in the 70s. So instead I went to Kathmandu, St. Xavier's School in Kathmandu, which had been set up by the Jesuits from Patna at the invitation of King Tribhuvan around 1950-51. So before I had any particular learning of languages or study of Hinduism, I spent 2 years teaching in a school where all the boys were Hindu and Buddhist. In the beautiful Kathmandu Valley, I had chances to go out into the hills and to see Mount Everest from a distance and so on, trips down to Bihar, to Patna, over to Calcutta. And I think originally the school was founded in order to bring Christian values to South Asia, Christian values to India and Nepal. But fairly early on, as a young man, I found that it was also helping me to understand the beauty of the religions of South Asia, of Hinduism, and that this was actually, for me, an eye-opening, widening experience. So beginning with that instinct that while I had certain values that I still have as a Catholic Christian, going to Nepal, going to India, expanded my horizons greatly, and I had so much to learn. So after I came back to the US, did seminary training, was ordained a priest in 1978, I was determined to do further study. And I was accepted to do my PhD study, as you mentioned, at the University of Chicago in the South Asia department, where I studied a great deal of Sanskrit literature, Tamil literature, and began my lifelong learning from traditions in Vedanta, Mimamsa, particularly in the Sri Vaishnava tradition of South India. Various reasons led me there. But all these years I've been studying these traditions. I have many, many books on my shelves and so on. But I've always loved going to India and being there in the presence of so many friends and so many places to visit. I've been privileged to go to so many temples, to so many divya deshas and holy places. And I think the more I learn, the more I realize I have to learn. And when people say, why would a Catholic priest be so interested in the study of Hinduism? I think in some ways it's like looking in a mirror. The mirror is not you, the mirror is different, but in the mirror you see yourself and you see yourself differently. So the lifelong learning that began in Kathmandu, as many years as I have left, I hope very much to continue learning and when possible to be back visiting in India again. So that's a start. Now we can talk further. Any questions you have as follow-up?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sir, actually, the theme of today's topic is bridging the gap between the East and the West in the postmodern period. Sir, what do you think, sir? Why is bridging the gap between the East and the West is necessary, particularly in this postmodern period, sir?
Well, I think it's a great, important starting point to balance what I said about how much I find in common and how much I have benefited from going to South Asia, India, Nepal, with realizing that there are gaps to be overcome. We are very mindful in the 21st century of history. And if we're candid, we know that the history of India and the West has not always been peaceful. There have been, maybe 90% of the time it has been peaceful and there's been useful exchange. But once the colonial period started, and around 1498, and various foreign groups came to India for economic reasons, for military reasons, for religious reasons, there was often a very uneven history. Some of it very unhappy, to tell you the truth. And I think the history and the heritage of colonialism is a great burden for India, I would guess, but also for the West. This kind of power imbalance and power relationship in which one culture has the advantage over the other. And I think much progress has been made since India's independence, becoming one of the great democracies of the world, one of the largest nations in the world. But there's also a sense that in the post-colonial, postmodern age, we have to be able to be honest and critical about the problems of misunderstanding, the problems of manipulation, and what others, not just post-colonial, but some people call Orientalism, the
Yes.
way in which India, China, Japan, other cultures are seen as exotic and in need of the West. There has to be some rebalancing and mutuality between East and West. There are many other issues one could mention about the state of our democracies today. I think, to be candid, certainly the United States has many problems in its politics today, its cultural context, the partisan divides, and so on. And I think I'm not the expert on India, but I would think there are challenges facing a democracy of 1 billion plus people with many factions and groups. All the more so then that India and the West need to recalculate the relationship, need to come to terms as peers, able to talk to each other in a respectful fashion. And for me, there are many ways this can be done, but to do it with a mindfulness of philosophical issues, religious issues that can help us on both sides to appreciate the other culture better. Then I think once the gaps have been faced and regret has been expressed about some of the things that happened in the past, then we can say going forward in the 21st century, the 22nd, 23rd century, India and countries like the United States with Christian, Jewish, Hindu roots, Islam present in both countries, can find ways to work together for the betterment of the entire world. But the honesty about the gaps and the problems in the post-colonial era have to be faced first.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That's right. Sir, as we know that you have dedicated a long period of your lifetime to visiting India and studying Hinduism. In this sense, sir, we can say that you are one of the champions who attempted to bridge the gap between the East and the West. Sir, what do you think? What are the factors that can really work to bridge the gap?
Well, I think, as I already said, and as you said before I did, the first starting point is to admit there's a gap and that there is misunderstanding, cultural difference, problematic history, and so on. But then I think once that has been admitted, it's not going to be useful for people to simply be expressing their opinions about the past or their opinions about the other culture, the other religious tradition, the other society. But there has to be then a sustained effort on all sides to think about and learn from the other traditions. Because I think too often we assume we know what we need to know about the other. We may have positive views or negative views, but I read something in the media, I read something online, I read something in the news, I saw some photographs. I know everything about the past. But that is highly unlikely. And therefore, the need in educational institutions such as yours and mine for us to study each other's histories, study each other's literature, study each other's traditions, in order to disabuse ourselves of stereotypes and caricatures about the other. So in my field, in the study of Hinduism, religion in South Asia, I think the West has made great progress since the 16th, 17th, 18th century in learning languages, finding and reading texts, being taught by Hindu teachers, and realizing that the great complicated traditions of South Asia bear deeper and deeper learning, just as our own traditions in the West. And some people will ask me, well, what is Hinduism? Just tell me what Hinduism is. And I have to tell them there is so much to learn, that there's not one thing called Hinduism. There are many different Shaiva traditions, Vaishnava traditions, Tantrika traditions, very large, you might say Brahminical traditions, very many vernacular local traditions, so many beliefs that are very complicated. Likewise, the West is not all one big lump of the West. There are many different forms of culture, language in the West. Christianity is not simply one thing, but it comes in different varieties, some of which are very evangelical, and some are very open to learning and interreligious negotiation. So while it sounds that while the problems facing us in the 21st century are often practical, about population, about poverty, about the environment, right now both our countries suffering greatly from COVID-19, it may sound rather boring to say we have to now go in the library, go online and study each other's cultures and traditions. But I think both Hinduism and Christianity recognize ignorance is a great problem. And if we proceed in ignorance, we often just get ourselves into deeper and deeper trouble. So learning who one another is, listening to one another, studying one another is absolutely necessary to overcoming the gaps that divide us even now.
Yes, sir. That ignorance is the thing which should be erased as early as possible. Sir, what according to you is the role of religion in narrowing the gap between the East and the West? Do differences of religious identity in any way widen the gap?
Well, you're asking another very good question that raises complications, because it can't be simply yes or simply no. Because to say simply religion is the answer to our problems would be somewhat over-romanticized and also ignorant of history. Saying simply religion is a problem, our world would be better with less religion, is also rather naive. It's based on an understanding of human nature or the world around us that imagines that secular culture, atheism would be the way forward, and that also seems to be rather impossible. So I think we have to have a balanced view that on the one side, there have been great religious differences in India, in the United States, in the West, in every part of the world where religious traditions have clashed with one another. I don't need to give the history, but Jewish and Christian, Christian and Muslim, Muslim and Hindu, Hindu and Christian. I mean, so many tensions have risen over the years, in part because people tend to say our culture and our religion are identified and yours is different, so let's see now who's going to win. And often there have been intrusions, military intrusions, colonial intrusions, evangelical intrusions, where, like it or not, the other religion shows up. So I think, again, we have to be aware and honest about the fact that religion can be a dividing point and a problem. Again, in my own background, I'm Irish American. In Ireland, Northern Ireland, there were for many decades Catholics and Protestants fighting one another. And to say this is really unfortunate because they're not fighting about religion, they're fighting about politics, economics, is true, but it also came down to the Catholics on one side, the Protestants on the other. And I think in all of our cultures, we can see that the chauvinism and the kind of the fundamentalists and extremists will take religion and use it as a reason for misunderstanding and cultivating hatred. But on the positive side, I think we believe religious people who have philosophical values is that ultimately reality is one. And
Yes.
ultimately there is a commonality that brings people together. In my Christian sense, I would say, and I think many Hindu traditions, there is one God for all of us. God brings us together. God wants us to come together. And that whatever divides us is always going to be less than the sense of truth, the sense of community, brotherhood, sisterhood, the things that bring us together. And that to draw on the wisdom of religious traditions, the Bible, the Quran, the Vedanta, Upanishad, Bhagavad Gita, Ramayana, all of these great texts, all the way up to modern figures, is an enormous resource for helping us to humanize one another, to learn to respect the other, and to see that intolerance, violence, terrorizing minorities, marginalizing people is not true to what religion is and should be at its best. Therefore, religion has its problems, but solving the world's problems by a better and deeper appreciation of the religions to which we belong is absolutely necessary and part of the way forward, I think.
Yes, sir, definitely. It is the color of the blood that shows that we are all equal.
Yes.
God made us all equal, sir. Sir, in one of your lecture, I heard you saying that you had been there at Dakshineshwar, at Belur Math, and you had a great connection with the Swamijis there of Ramakrishna order. Sir, why Sri Ramakrishna is important even today?
Well, I think this too has a history to it. So I think when I was in graduate school, I did not study Bengal. I learned Tamil a bit and Sanskrit, but I didn't study Bengali or spend much time in Bengal and Calcutta. But early on, as many Americans, I would know something about Swami Vivekananda, of course. We could talk about him later. But then also I found who is his teacher. And Sri Ramakrishna came to the fore. And so reading the great master, as it's often translated, the Gospel of Ramakrishna, I began to find that this was a fascinating story of a mystic, a saint, a human being who found the goddess to be his mother, an intense lover of all divine possibilities. And I think I found him to be a kind of interreligious universal figure, that once one realizes he's not simply a priest at a small temple outside Calcutta in Dakshineshwar, but has these kind of universal insights and values, it became more interesting to me. And on that basis, I wrote a few small articles for different magazines and so on. But then I was introduced to different swamis. First of
Yes.
all, in Boston, Swami Sarvagatananda was for many years the Vedanta Swami in Boston. Swami Chaitanananda in St. Louis, and other swamis. In Chennai, where I lived lived in Mylapore, near Mylapore for some time. Swamis at the mutt, the Ramakrishna mutt there. I was invited up to the Gold Park, the Cultural Institute in Calcutta, to give some lectures. Went to Dakshineshwar, Belur Math several times. And one of my good friends today is Swami Tyagananda, who is the Swami in Boston now. And in fact, we'll be team teaching a course together next year. So I think it built this set of relationships. The other thing I'd add is that we also had the privilege of having a very well-known Ramakrishna monk, Swami Sarva Priyananda, was with us at Harvard for the whole year last year. And he took courses, he gave lectures and so on like that. So I think at a deep level, Ramakrishna opens the door to kind of a universal understanding across religious boundaries. His own mystical experience captures our imagination and then shows us a way of interreligious relating that is very basic and very deep. And so one of the great religious figures of the last centuries has to be Ramakrishna, and I think he speaks very well to the Christian sensitivity as well.
Yes, sir. Sir, another one, then we have to come to Swami Vivekananda after Ramakrishna. Sir, what according to you was Swami Vivekananda's role as a champion of bringing about a confluence between the East and the West?
I mean, I think people have often made a very simple comparison, which is like any comparison doesn't work 100%, but that the key figure in the Christian tradition is Jesus Christ. But that who would have known Jesus Christ and who would have understood him properly if St. Paul had not come along and traveled around the empire, the Mediterranean, and brought the message of Jesus to Athens, to Rome, to other Corinth and other great cities. I think in a similar way, the heritage of Sri Ramakrishna himself is enough in itself. But you have to be aware, we all have to be aware, that the group of disciples he gathered around himself, even in the Great Master, even in the Gospel, the group is gathering, was important in remembering him and passing down his heritage. And obviously the leader of that group was Swami Vivekananda. And I think the remarkable fact that he did many great things, but two great things. One was to organize the community after the death of Sri Ramakrishna. So founding the Ramakrishna order, the Vedanta Society, setting up the rules for the order that are still, I think, largely followed today, and saying that we can be an ongoing religious community of monks, swamis, but also with a very large lay community around. Then we can have schools and clinics and hospitals and so on. So all of that, which is less known and less appreciated in the West, is extremely important, that he was a great organizer of traditions and kept alive the memory and encouraged different swamis to write the Great Master, the Gospel, and so on like that. But obviously, when Westerners who have heard of Swami Vivekananda, they often think of this very imposing figure wearing a turban at the Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893. And it was a very, you might say, a God-given providential moment that Swami was able to raise the money to come over to America after some hardships to find his way to Chicago. And at one of the first great occasions where the Parliament of Religions, people of all different religious traditions, mostly American, mostly Christian, mostly men, came together. Nonetheless, that this dynamic figure, Vivekananda, would be present. It would be very good if we had video of him speaking there, because everyone said what a dynamic speaker he was. So I think he made a great impression as a person, that now this living tradition of India, of Hinduism, Vedanta, Ramakrishna is now come to the West. But then he persisted. He gave his talks at the Parliament of Religions, but as everyone knows, he traveled to Boston, he traveled to New York, he was in Pasadena, California, he was in London, and he was a very eloquent speaker, but also a very clear teacher. And if you go back through the 9-10 volumes of his collected works, his teachings are very lucid and very clear. His most famously, perhaps, his teaching of the yoga, going through the Yoga Sutras and explaining them, but then speaking on Vedanta, speaking on East-West, speaking on the meaning of God. The beautiful lecture he gives, My Master, talking about what Ramakrishna meant for him. I think for most people in the West, he was this eye-opening figure who made it possible for people to begin to understand through his teachings the great and deep traditions of India. Other Swamis came after him, Paramahamsa, Yogananda, Swami Prabhupada much later. But if you had to pick one figure who kind of opened the new age of interconnection between East and West, Hindu and Christian, Vivekananda was the one. And it's remarkable that he was able to do all of this dying at such an early age, before he was 40 years old.
Yes, yes.
So I think he plus the genius of Sri Ramakrishna opened up a new age in interreligious understanding.
Yes, sir. Only 39 years we had him, no?
Yeah.
Sir, yeah. Not only, sir, Swami Vivekananda, you have worked on Sri Shankara, Swami Ramanuja, Swami Narayana. So what do you think, whether their teachings can work for bringing the negotiation between the Orient and the Occident in this postmodern period?
Well, I think that's a very good follow-up question, because the temptation might be in such a conversation to just stay with the 19th, 20th century and say, okay, we have everything we need with us right now. But I think early on, because I had good classical training in Latin and Greek, the classics of the Christian tradition, I realized I wanted to go back to the great traditions. So the darshanas, as you mentioned earlier, my PhD thesis was in Purva Mimamsa on Jaimini Shabara. But then, obviously, as a great interest to me and to others, the Upanishads, the Brahma Sutras, the Uttara Mimamsa Sutras, and then the great acharyas, beginning with Shankara, who taught the sutras and commented on them. And this, I think, is a difficult step that not everyone can take. It's one thing to read modern interpretations, to read things in a simple fashion, but to be able to go back and say, now I'm going to read Sri Shankara's commentary on the Kathopanishad, or I'm going to read his commentary on the first 4 sutras of the Brahma Sutras, because it gets very philosophical. There are many distinctions made. He's also debating with other pundits. He's arguing sometimes with the Nyayikas, the logicians, the Mimamsa teachers, sometimes with the Buddhists, with the Jains. And the slow process of reading the Upanishads and learning the Vedanta with Shankara and seeing his vision unfold of all is one, Atman, Brahman, the way of thinking about the finite world in which we live is only kind of an interlude before we have this Satchitananda bliss. You have to go and read his work. Luckily, the Ramakrishna Order, most of these books are now available in English, but for those who can, to read them in the original and to study them carefully. I think Shankara, my personal experience in Tamil Nadu for so many years on and off, Ramanuja became extremely important, his version of Vedanta, which I think is largely he and Shankara and others, Madhva and others, Nimbarka, would agree on 70, 80% or more of what Vedanta is. But then there are sectarian differences, the nature of ultimate reality and so on. And I think looking at these traditions, you can say, do we really need to bother with all of this detail? And I think, again, they can help us in the 21st century, not in the sense to say that every Indian should now be reading Shankara and Ramanuja. No, that's not possible, or even reading a summary of them. But there have to be educated teachers, educated people who know these traditions, who change their own way of thinking by immersion in the classics of the past, in order then to be able to teach in the colleges and the schools and the universities and say philosophy in the 21st century, religion in the 21st century is not simply what you read on the internet, or it's not simply what some politician get up and said, but you have to go back to the tradition. And I say the same thing in the United States. It's one thing to look at lived religion in our pluralistic society, but it's also extremely important for Christians to go back to the Christian classics, for Jews to go back to the rabbinic tradition, for Muslims to read the Quran and the commentaries on the Quran and so on. And I think the idea is that the present moment is, in a sense, progressing. It's the future in the present moment. But we are extremely dependent on the past in a bad sense, the burden of our sins and our karma, but also in a very good sense that there is this increasing body of wisdom over thousands of years that we're foolish to close the books and say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm too busy to learn from the past. So to sit down and read Shankara, Ramanuja, or other such teachers is extremely mind-changing, soul-purifying, logically challenging, and then helps us to be better teachers and better citizens in our cultures, I think. That's extremely important, I think.
Yes, sir. That one is the most important one. Sir, another question. So what do you think about the European concept of nation? Is it different from the notion of the nation in the East, and especially in the Indian subcontinent? And sir, how is religion related to the concept of nation?
Okay, well, this is an area I think I would have to be candid to say that you really want to talk to a political scientist to get the real understanding, or a social theorist. But my understanding is that on the one level, the nation state as it developed in the modern West is a cultural production that is not essential. So when we look and say, let's just take Western Europe, let's say England and France and Germany and Italy, Austria, Ireland, or the United States and Canada, and on, that these countries are historically limited cultural artifacts, the nation state. And if you look back, if we turn back the clock 500 years, the map of Europe would look very different. There were empires, there were kingdoms, the borders shifting all the time. And I think the idea of nation state became a practical, manageable way to organize civil society, to have a sense of local responsibility for the production of everything that was needed for the people. And that for many, many nations, democracy seems to have worked as the best of all the systems, even with its own problems. The problem, of course, with the nation state in the West even would be drawing artificial lines and building artificial walls that somehow pretend that one side is entirely different from the other side. And that's where the nation state, with its chauvinism, with its super patriotism, becomes a problem, as if to say Ireland and England are entirely different, or France and Germany are entirely different, or the United States and Mexico are so different we should have a giant wall between them. These become arbitrary political decisions about demonizing the other, demonizing the outsider. And I think there have been efforts, you can see, it's still the West, and I'll say something about India, to overcome the narrowness of nation thinking. So the European Union is a very good example. The United States, back in its origin in the late 18th century, forming a union instead of simply every state being separate. Brexit might be a step backward in the wrong direction by England, United Kingdom drawing itself outside. But there's an impulse toward at least not making one big nation out of everybody, but having international relationships, the African Union, Asian organizations for good harmony. So I think when it comes to Asia, then as in every other case, it's not a good idea to simply say, well, this is what the West did, let's apply it here. So imagine how foolish and what a great loss it would be to say, well, the English language is pretty good, therefore no one should speak Hindi or Bengali or all the other languages of India, let's replace them all with English. A very bad idea. Or let's have only one religion and let it be the religion of the people from the West. A very bad idea. Likewise, then, to say India as an independent nation should be exactly what the British thought it should be, and should have a polity and a way of acting that is simply that of the West, would be like saying if a plant grows well in America or Northern Europe somewhere, well, then obviously it will grow well in Asia, in Asian soil. No, things have to be adapted and changed. Now, it's not to say there's not a lot to be learned from other religions and cultures, or even from nations, about, let's say, the value of democracy, the value of human rights, the value of freedom of speech, the ways in which many countries have learned through hard experience that majorities should not terrorize or bully minorities, but everyone has a dignity and a right, and that in a nation, the rich are responsible to care for the poor. It's not a free-for-all capitalism, but everybody is part of the nation together. All of these are values that I think can be applicable anywhere in the world. Just as in the West, I think can learn a lot from traditional India about how to live in harmony with people who are religiously different, culturally different, linguistically different, different ethnic backgrounds, and so on. It's remarkable how over so many generations, India has been able to weave together a society out of so many different kinds of people with so many different kinds of cultures. So the learning can go in both directions, and there can be a lot of wisdom gained by paying attention to what other countries have done. But again, it doesn't come down to mere imitation. Because they did it that way, we should do it the same way. But rather, what does it mean to be India is up to the people of India to decide. What does it mean to be in the United States is up to the people of the United States, and so on. And I think we have to try to help one another, but also back off and say, you are the citizens of this country. You are the ones who need to make this work out on the ground.
Yes,
I hope that
yes,
helps.
you are definitely right, sir. So another one, sir, do you think the impact of religion has a great impact in the socio-political conditions of the Indian subcontinent and of course in the United States? And if so, how is religion affecting our socio and political lives in both the countries?
Well, this again would be a case where my expertise is limited. Although I've come to India maybe some 20 times over the years, I don't live there. I'm not an Indian, obviously, but I'm also not. My life is not in India, and there are so many things I miss. Reading about India in the press and so on like that can be misleading, and therefore I'm limited. I'm sure other people on your program can think about religion and society in India today. But I think it's a largely positive phenomenon that, as we said earlier, is religion a good thing or a bad thing for humanity? I think for any country, and I would say the same about the West, that for India, it's good to have explicit, living, alive, fruitful religious traditions that have a voice in society. And that the idea of kind of an empty secularism where religion is removed from public life and people are basically lip service only to religion and actually don't practice religion is a bad thing. I mean, it's like not watering the fields. It's like not having the sunshine. There's a way in which religion can humanize us, can bring us together, can authentically say who we are. Just like literature, like poetry, like the arts, religion should be a part. And I think everyone has to grow up and be mature and say, given our histories, we're always going to be in cultures, and this is true of the United States as well as India, where people of other religious traditions are present too. And rather than lamenting and saying, well, we should all be of one religion, rather to respect the diversity of religions, the diversity of sacred texts, the diversity of ways of worship, and so on, can only make for, I would say, as an outsider, for a better India, to have this diversity as part of India. Now, the danger, of course, goes back to, again, one of your earlier questions. Won't this lead to fanaticism? Won't this lead to the one group bullying the other, or hatred between communal groups? That can happen because religious traditions have their dark side. Religious traditions have sometimes been intolerant or confused the truth with my truth, or confused the right way to act with only the way we act, or demonizing the other. Well, you dress differently, you wear a different kind of clothing, therefore you're not like us, you're not human like us, therefore we'll control society, not you. You can see all the bad ways that religion might turn out to be divisive in society. And in the United States, certainly, and I think in India, this may be the case too, there are politicians who use religion in order to achieve their political ends. They may hold up a sacred book and wave it at the audience and say, see, I'm a very religious person, but they may never have opened the book and read the book. They're just holding it and saying, religion is on my side, God is with us, not with them. And that's very, it shows ignorance of one's own religious tradition, and it's also using religion as a weapon when religion should be a hand, offered in peace. So it's a tricky thing, but I'd say I'm definitely, unsurprisingly, on the side of saying that religion, societies are better if religion is part of them, and that my perception of India, my limited travel, north, south, east, and west in India, is that it's a beautiful country, it's a powerfully rich cultural country, a country with a great future, because there are Hindus of so many different kinds and communities. There are Muslims, there are Parsis, there are Sikhs, there are Christians, there are Buddhists, and other smaller groups also. All of this is a wonderful thing that makes for a better India, provided everybody keeps working together to say we will respect and learn from each other interreligiously. That's what India is about. India is not about division or hatred or communalism, but ways of bringing us together in which we remain religious, don't become secular in a narrow, flat sense, remain religious, but in a way that respects human rights and human dignity for all people.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That is the thing. So, in India, we have a tradition of listening and worshipping many religious gurus of our society. They told us something important, but most of us hardly follow their messages, even if we worship them. Sir, why is it so?
Well, I mean, why are people? I mean, this is a great basic human question. Uh, why are people lazy? Why do people act in foolish ways? Why do people hear what is actually good and then do the wrong thing? Why do people do things that they know? I mean, it could be physical things like drinking too much, using drugs, sexual abuse, all kinds of things that can happen that people know in their heads are wrong, and they still do the wrong thing. Accumulating money greedily and keeping it away from the poor. People know that these things are wrong, but they still do them. So all these things are problems. But I think it's a particular case you're pointing to, where there are great teachers who give us clear teaching about how to live and how to act, and we ignore them. So we talked earlier, Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, Mahatma Gandhi's teachings in so many ways are not outdated, but still living. Back to the classics. Let's say the most obvious text, the Bhagavad Gita, as a text that isn't a blueprint for the 21st century. You can't just say everything in the Gita fits 2020, but there is so much wisdom there about how to live in 2020. And these teachings have been there for thousands of years, and other religious traditions as well. I think perhaps sometimes people don't follow these teachings, ancient or modern. One thing, they're not paying attention. Two, they don't want to devote the time to it. They're too busy. I'll hear the Swami speak, I'll hear the priest speak, I'll look at the book, flip through it, put it aside because I have other things to do. And some people are too busy. They don't have the time to focus. But I think it's also a challenge, and this is certainly true in my Christian tradition. If I was to listen to the challenge and the wisdom of Jesus, it would mean a certain discipline in my way of life, a certain detachment from material pleasures, a certain sense of getting beyond selfishness, getting beyond anger, getting beyond ignorance. All of these things are hard at first. And as Jesus says in the gospel, if you would be my disciple, take up your cross and follow me. And so an honest teacher who's not just making a big show in order to have thousands of followers, has to remind the audience that I'm asking you to change your life. And to change your life can be breaking bad habits that are yours, your family's, your culture's, to break away from egoisms, selfishness, greed, and so on. These are things that are hard to change. And so many of the basic teachings in the Gita, the Yoga Sutras, the Bible, the Quran, and other great texts are about the hard choices we need to make to be better human beings and live spiritual lives. And so I think at some level, it can also be, this I think is maybe it's part of what you're asking. People hear the teachings and say, I don't really want to do that. I want people to think I do that. I want people to think I'm a follower of the teacher, but I'm not about to change my life because my ego is too big, my pride is too great, my selfishness is too strong, and I don't really want to change. If only people would do it, I think the great teachers promise us, if you would listen, if you would change your life, then on the other side of ego and selfishness is much deeper, greater happiness for yourself and others. But I think the barrier of the breakthrough is like withdrawing from an addiction. So, God forbid somebody is using drugs all the time. The other side of it will be when they're no longer using drugs and they get their life back. But in between is the withdrawal period. And some people say, I want to give up drugs, I want to give up smoking, whatever, but I can't. And I think it's the same with the teachings of the great teachers. I really want to be like that, but it's too hard. I can't get from here to there. And that's why we need to help each other. That's why we have teachers, spiritual guides, communities, to help people to get out of their ego selfishness into the better way of life. but it's the teachers most often try their best to communicate, but then people basically have to do it themselves to follow the teaching, and a lot of times it's too hard and we don't really want to do it.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
So do you
So do you
think,
think,
sir, let me check. Probably there is some problem in my microphone. It is getting echoed. Sir, can you hear me properly?
I can hear you
Sir?
properly.
Yes, sir. Let me continue. Sir, do you think the sacred religious texts can play really a role in bridging the gap between the Orient and the Occident, which is very much related to the previous question? Sir, please.
Well, I think this is one of the best ways to do it. There are many ways in which East and West can relate to one another. When COVID-19 is over, traveling back and forth is important. I mean, so many people move back and forth and see the cultures and so on. This is all very important and very valuable. But I think one of the greatest ways for this to happen is through the study of the great texts, because these books, they may originally have been oral teachings, they may have been passed down from teacher to student, but once they are put in words on the page and then translated into languages so people can read them, then these became the great ambassadors of interreligious wisdom. So for me, even though I've come to India so many times, it's on a daily basis, it's reading the Sanskrit, reading the Tamil text that are my teachers about what Hinduism is really like. And so learning from the text is so important. And again, I'll tell my students who are Christian or Jewish, read the Bible, read the thinkers of your tradition. And I would say to my Hindu friends, you can't just talk about Christianity in some vague sense. You heard of Jesus, this and that, but you actually have to pick up a gospel and read it from the first chapter to the last chapter. You have to, if I read Shankara, Ramanuja, and other great thinkers, then read Augustine, read Aquinas, read Luther, read Calvin. And so I think we're literate people. We live in a literate world where increasingly people are able to read and study. And therefore, the study of other people's religious traditions becomes so important. Because the caricature, again, the ignorance is, well, they have nothing to teach us. Their teachings are all superstition. Falls away when you begin to read what they actually say. And be it the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, the Quran, whatever text, opening the book and reading it can be a life-changing experience, not because you convert and become a member of the other religion, but because you say, oh my God, this is what they actually believe. Isn't that so important and so interesting? So if everybody in the world, all 7-8 billion people would everybody take a book of another religion and start studying it, we would all be better off. Or even if 100,000 people did it, we'd be off to a better start. But I firmly believe that study is important, and therefore every college, every school, every university should have religion philosophy departments where these things are taught, because otherwise students will not learn these things.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Sir, actually, I requested our participants to give some questions beforehand. So the huge response came yesterday. Sir, can I go through some of the selected questions?
Sure.
Yes, sir. Ayantika Maitra, she asked a question. Can the gap between the West and the East really be bridged, as there is a constant struggle among the nations to assert supremacy over each other politically as well as economically?
Well, I think, again, I'm not a scholar of international affairs or global politics and so on, but as somebody who reads the newspapers and looks at news on the web and travels and so on, I think, again, it's not surprising that on the one side, there is this competition to be the greatest. It's this country wants to be number one. This country says it's better than all other countries. These countries start skirmishing their troops on the border or the ships on the sea, whatever, competition, trying to get natural resources, trying to get ahead of the other nations, jockeying for position. I mean, as long as we have had human history in any part of the world, this has been going on, because nations and their leaders are human beings who have ego, who have greed, who have fear, who ply in ignorance in order to push the other aside. So I think in some ways there are always going to be problems, and we're in this increasing age. When people look back from a century from now and say the 21st century was an intense period of globalization, far more than we ourselves in it can even imagine. Of course, there are going to be growing pains. But I think what's happening, and sadly, in a tragic way, COVID-19 shows us, we are all connected to one another. There's no exemption, and that there's not going to be a time in the future when one nation is the only great nation, or one culture builds a giant wall around itself to keep everybody else out. We are going to be interconnected as the people in some village are connected, or my neighbors across the street, my neighbors across the world. So how this works out politically has to be, we need political leaders, we need economic, business leaders who have sensible heads on their shoulders and honest hearts, who are working for the betterment. And therefore, in democracies, people have to not be electing demagogues and people who cater to their fears, but people who seem to care about the good of the nation, the international good. It's going to be hard. And so long after my lifetime is over, there'll still be fighting among nations. But I think if we bring all our human and religious resources to bear and have decent leadership, we'll be making the inevitable one world a better world, decade by decade.
Yes, of course. And the mantra is unity in diversity, what we, the Indians, believe always.
Right.
Sir, another participant, Atri Majumdar, he asked, sir, please discuss about the intersection of the discourses of theology and contemporary politics. How do they influence each other? Does this politico-theological discourse determine the ethical and moral constitution of postmodern alienated individuals?
So that's a super advanced question, very technical question, which I can only answer in part here, but I'm very grateful to hear the question. I think theology and politics is a very good way to put it, because it's not just about religion and politics. Because in the 20th, 21st century, again, repeating myself, but lots of politicians talk about religion a lot, and a lot of religious people try to use politics to get their way. So there's a lot of that going on. But when I hear the word theology and consider myself a theologian, it is a combination of spiritual and intellectual values, with the knowledge of the present moment and the knowledge of the traditions before us. So you might say that theology is one of the ways that religions become intellectual, become ethical, and become wise. And therefore, rather than letting religions be pawns in the hands of politicians who make religion whatever they want it to be, quote whatever figure they want, out of context, etc., theology, and to some extent philosophy of religion, help people to think seriously about what their traditions teach and become thoughtful religious people with honesty about the history, honesty about the sources, honesty about what religions can do or not, and interreligious knowledge that then becomes extremely important in putting politics back in its place. So instead of letting the politicians simply wrap themselves in religion and claim to be political religious leaders, the intellectual who's trained theologically in some way, who knows the traditions, who's educated, is able to say, but you're not representing our religious traditions properly. You're not understanding the great teachers. You don't seem, Mr. Politician, to actually have read the books you keep talking about, and so on. And politicians, can point out to religious leaders, look, the kind of sermons you're giving are dangerous, or the kinds of things you're doing are leading to disharmony in the community. So it's a two-way street. But I think in the post-colonial period, in the postmodern world, there is still a need for us to understand with some detail, with educated knowledge, the religious traditions that we talk about. And if we do that, then we have more and more citizens who are educated religiously, who will not be swayed by somebody standing up on the stage just saying this or that about religion or one figure in religion or another, but it becomes a matter of intelligent participation in society where religious knowledge is essential. Again, this can sound rather like a school teacher. The professor, of course, says we should all be learning. But I think if people knew their religions better, then that would change the very dynamics of politics in countries and between countries. But part of the haste of postmodern society sometimes can be to say, we've had enough religion, we know everything we need to know about religion, now let's just talk. And I think that's precisely wrong, because in a postmodern age, we're in danger of losing the traditions we keep talking about. And so we have to go back to them, we have to learn from them again, if politics and religion are going to work together. We need, as the questioner said, politics and theology, not just politics and
Yes, yes. Sir, another participant, Shambhavi Mishra, she asked, is an assimilated, globalized identity a threat to native identities and culture? How do we deal with the menace that such hybridized identities pose on cultures, especially in Commonwealth countries?
So again, this is an excellent question, and it could take a long time to answer it. And again, the Commonwealth countries, the overview of the Commonwealth countries and so on, this is not my expertise. But again, my answer in part would be that there is always a tension between somebody who has a very strong local identity and those who have larger and more complicated identities. So as it's put in terms of kind of a cosmopolitan, internationalist identity and thinking of the global scene, as opposed to thinking of, make us great, make our country great. There's going to be a tension there. And often people who only know their own country, their own city, their own state, their own culture, their own religion, their own language, will accuse the others of being disloyal and not being totally 100% one of us. And the cosmopolitans, the internationalists, can also be in danger of being condescending and saying, you stupid people, you don't know anything about the world outside your village, or you don't know enough because you haven't traveled. But I think there's a tension there between, again, having local roots and believing that you're at home somewhere, and yet having a sense, well, there is such a thing as international reality. There is such a thing as Commonwealth. There is such a thing as organizations that bring certain states closer to one another, and that it's going to happen poorly or well, we might as well make sure it happens well, that these international connections take place. But we don't want it to be, again, the sense of some kind of super class of super leaders who, for capitalist reasons, or the owners of large corporations or international businesses, trample on local governments, trample on the economies in order to make more money by running around the world with markets and natural resources. Again, I'm not an economist, but I think there has to be some concern in every nation and among nations to foster the international without letting there be a superclass of very rich international people who take advantage of everyone else. And that's a balance. I think I'll stop there because this is outside my expertise, but some sense of getting my country straight and clear has to be coupled with how do we relate to our neighbors, our close neighbors and then our far neighbors, in order to live in harmony that's fair to both without betraying the values of my own culture in the first place.
Yes. Another participant, she had put forward two questions. I am taking one. It is a very big question. Contemporary debates on violence often dwell on the role of religion in perpetrating acts of violence, especially in the context of terrorism. Do religious identities indeed have a role to play in violence and terrorism today, particularly in the Middle East? Or is there a need to go beyond religion to prove the root cause of terrorism? Could you, sir, suggest further reading in this regard?
I can give some pointers. I'm not ready to give a bibliography. I mean, I could follow up. I could send you something later if you wanted to send it to this person. But again, I think, and this theme has come up before about religion's good and bad, the role of religion in society. It would be fake or false for us to pretend that religions have never been implicated in violence, or that people are not violent sometimes because they claim for religious reasons. Our way is the true way. Death to the unbelievers. This land is our land only. You have no right to be here. We'll destroy your sacred places so that our sacred places can take their place. Religion plays this role, and it's often justified saying, oh, if you go look in that scripture, there's a scene where God told them to kill the other ones and so on. And there seems to be, roots of violence that have religious roots. But I think religious people in the 21st century have to take ownership and say, but that's not what our religions are about at their best. And to be able to say, yes, in every part of the world, you could go through a list of religiously defined violence and acts of terrorism and fundamentalism where religion is explicitly put in the front as the reason why we blew up your building, or why we killed those people, or built a wall, whatever. But I think the majority of religious people and those who know something about the traditions to which they belong have to be able to push back and say, but your fundamentalist, fanatic hatred for the other is not true even to your own religion. You act like somebody who doesn't even know your own scriptures. You're betraying the values of the great teachers of your tradition by the ignorance and violence you perpetrate. It's easy to give lip service and say, well, all religions teach love of neighbor, which is true. And again, I don't want to whitewash it by saying religions have never been violent, but the majority of us who are religious and believe in nonviolence and peace have to grab the microphone and say, you who are using this for demagogical purposes and stirring up hatred, you don't even know your own religion. And you're an embarrassment to your religion because you're betraying the basic values that have enabled the religion to last for thousands of years. So it's a tricky thing. And if we were having a class, somebody could push back with me with 10 questions, I'm sure. But I think the gist of it, you can see, is that, as I said much earlier, ignorance is a great problem. And people who are ignorant of their own religion are an even greater problem, because religion in the hands of ignorant people who claim to speak for it can be exceedingly dangerous. And therefore, people who study and know their own religions have to push back and say, this is the religion, not what you pretend it to be.
Yes.
But I don't have a bibliography ready, so that'll have to come later.
Yes, okay, so fine. Another person, Bruce Wayne, he asked, could you please reveal points of tension and disagreement that could rise in bridging the gap between the East and West in the postmodern world?
So points of tension between?
Yes. Points of tension and disagreement that could rise in bridging the gap between the East and the West in the postmodern period.
Well, I think, as I said earlier, I mean, there's a long history of imbalance. There are the sins of colonialism, the sins of colonization and the imposition of one culture on another, military invasions, takeovers, the way in which wealthy people have bullied poorer people or deprived people of their own natural resources and made them poorer. So there are all these resentments. And we obviously are in a world where we want to rectify these differences. We want to be able to find ways forward, but along the way there are going to be further tensions because change is frightening and change is costly. And so to take again, I'm not an economist, I'm not a political scientist, etc., but take the United States and India. So the United States has its own troubles, but it's a very wealthy country. India does a marvelous job with a very large population, but there are many, many poor people. And in some ways you can say, why is the United States, why is England and such countries rich and India much poorer? Part of that is the imbalances of colonialism. So we can't just say, let's all forget the past and have harmony between nations. There have to be something you might, either not exactly, but something like reparations, where rich nations acknowledge that they owe it to poorer nations to restore what they took from them hundreds of years ago. We're having this debate in the United States now about race, about the sad history of slavery. It's not enough to say, let's forget the past and move forward, but it's a way in which some people are poor and other people are wealthy because of hundreds of years of imbalance and injustice. So if in the United States would like to have a better relationship, it's hard to forget the imbalances, and it's quite fair for a country like India to say, but you owe it to us to give more than we can give because you took more in the past. And again, this may be more England than the United States, but nonetheless. Or about global warming is another good example. The whole idea of reducing the carbon footprint, of reducing reliance on fossil fuels and all that. And it's fair for people in India and other parts of Asia to say, it's easy for you in the West who built your great economies using fossil fuels to tell us to stop doing it. But are you going to help us to do it economically so that we are not simply caught in no more fossil fuels, we'll remain poor and you'll remain rich? And so that becomes another point of tension between how do we save the environment, save the ecology. It can't be by telling India and China, for instance, you stop using fossil fuels and we don't need to in the West anymore because we did it for hundreds of years. No, there has to be some recognition that the problems go much deeper. So these are just several examples, and I'm not sure if they answer the question about when you try to move forward, uncomfortable issues come to the fore. I suppose one third one would be human rights. So if you really want cultures to relate to one another, then the issue of human rights comes to the fore. And one culture can't say, we want to do business with you, we want to travel there, we want to have exchanges of various sorts, but out, we're not going to allow you to say anything about how we treat our citizens. Or we're not going to say anything, allow you to say anything about freedom of the press or freedom of religion. No, if you want to be part of a global interconnected world, then you have to be able to receive the critique of others saying, yeah, but you're not giving rights to minorities. You're locking up journalists. You're terrorizing groups that are opposed to the government. And this in any cultural exchange is the case, where that's just a third example of saying, if we really want to be interconnected, then we have to be able to have moral critique across religious boundaries and national boundaries as well.
Yes, sir, one last question, and then coming back to Swami Vivekananda, Dr. Prashanta Chakrabarti, he had put this question. Would you please enlighten us on how Vivekananda used religion in the Indian Renaissance? That is his question.
Okay, that's a very good question. I would want to call in several of my professor friends who are experts on the Renaissance, the Hindu Renaissance in Bengal in the 19th century to answer this properly. But I would say several things, and appreciate the question, is that obviously Swami Vivekananda was not the first kind of modernizer thinker about how to reform religion and bring it into the modern era. There are many figures in Bengal, writing in English, writing in Bengali, who are doing this before him. So everybody points to Ram Mohan Roy, Keshav Chandra Sen, a little bit later, I suppose, Rabindranath Tagore. There are figures who were, before Vivekananda, struggling to say, how do we take religious traditions that in some ways seem to have become static, stultified, fossilized, living in a way that doesn't suit the society we're in, how do we shake them up and open them up without destroying them? So we have to do something. And I think even if you read books like the Gospel of Ramakrishna, you can see the conversations that Keshav Chandra Sen and others have with Ramakrishna when they come about the future of Hinduism. So I think, again, Vivekananda is a really interesting example. because he was incredibly successful in imagining kind of a new India, you might say, a new Hinduism, by specifically drawing on Vedanta roots as he understood it. And there are many ways of understanding Vedanta, even Shankara Vedanta. But Vivekananda was able to go back to the Gita, the Upanishads, basic principles of Atman, Brahman, the truth, the real and the unreal, and put these in simple terms that succeeded more than the Brahma Samaj, the Arya Samaj, in capturing the imagination of people around India and people around the world. And that's why his legacy, those 9 or 10 volumes of his collected works, still matter, because he kind of helped create the blueprint, the language of not a modern monolithic Hinduism, but a modern kind of interreligiosity that we name Hinduism, with some kind of Vedanta roots as making it all work out. He started this, other Swamis were part of this, people like Dr. Radhakrishnan came along and did their work on Vedanta. You could say in another way, Gandhi did his work, the critique from Dr. Ambedkar, other teachers up to the modern teachers with the discourses being given on the internet, all play a role in kind of rethinking Hinduism for the 20th and 21st century. But I think anyone who's honest would say, yeah, it didn't begin with Vivekananda because of the figures preceding him, but surely he was like one of the most monumental figures in creating, in English, I suppose, a common language that people in South India, West India, other parts of India could say, we can buy into this and talk about something about the Hinduism of our age. People can critique it and fine tune it. All that's, of course, going to happen. But that Vivekananda was kind of sketching out a vision for Hinduism that would work even today, and he seems to have been very successful in doing so.
Yes, sir, how can I express my gratitude? I can't express my words, sir. Thank you so much for being so generous in sharing your knowledge with us. We are really overwhelmed, honored, and blessed by your presence, sir. We shall cherish the memories just spent with you for a long time, sir. And thank you very much, sir, for this delightful question-answer session. Sir, now my HOD, Srimati Sharbari Nath, she will convey the formal vote of thanks to you. So, please.
Okay, thank you. Hello.
Hello.
Madam, please unmute your mic. Madam, unmute your mic.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Clooney, sir. We are really greatly indebted to you for attending our webinar. Sir, your session was full of wisdom, harmony, and universal understanding. Sir, in this COVID situation, when everyone has become frustrated, irritated, and when our future is at risk and uncertain, at that time, your words were really soothing to our ears. The gospel that you have preached has touched our heart. As you have said, violence, terrorism, developing bad habits, marginalizing the oppressed is no way to show our faith in religion. So I think we should all try to develop universal understanding and try to preach all men are equal and all roads of belief lead towards God. So, sir, we are very, very thankful and moved by your talk. We pray to God for your hearty and healthy life. Thank you again, sir, and please stay safe, sir. We are really overwhelmed, sir. Yeah.
Thank you.
Please stay safe.
I'm very pleased to be part of this webinar.
Yeah, and sir, namaskar, sir.
And
we
sir,
are really,
we are
really blessed having you. I don't know, sir. I have from my younger age, I was taught in a missionary school, and I had fathers. I don't know if everybody calls you father or not. I felt like calling you father because we used to call them father, and I was brought up amidst the Roman Catholics. So I don't know. I just loved your session, and I really pray that you live happily and heartily, sir, and very healthy. And
Thank you. God bless you all for a wonderful occasion.
And sir, one thing is that the topic of our webinar was neither East nor West, Vistas of Postcolonial Discourses. And I think, sir, through you, it was just merged, sir. The East and West are
Yes.
merged together, sir. So the bridge is already here, sir. You are the bridge, sir,
Bridge.
between the
Yeah.
East and the West, sir. Sir, please stay safe, stay well, sir. Please bless us so that we can follow your
Call you
path, sir.
again. Yeah, and
Okay.
Yes,
call you
sir.
again, sir.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you
We are
so much.
really blessed.
Namaskar.
Thank
We are really blessed.
Thank you.
So, dear participants, I hope that you have enjoyed this session very well, and we can see so many comments are coming here. We are really overwhelmed that we can arrange such a session uh, for all of you. And that was a truly knowledgeable session. And we are, the organizers are really blessed. So tomorrow there will be another session from 11 a.m. We are going to start. So please be with us. Tomorrow we have the speakers from America, from Saudi Arabia, and from India also. There will be 3 lectures. So we will be back at 11 a.m. in the morning. So till then,
Please.
goodbye. Yeah, stay safe, stay virtually connected, and learn. And that's all from our session. A very good night for all of you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much,
sir.
sir.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you, sir. Bye, sir.
Bye.